The farmer lived alone for years until he bought the last Apache woman left behind. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Reed Halston guided the tired mule team down the main stretch of Redstone, crossing with the same slow steadiness he used for every job that kept his ranch from collapsing. His coat was dusted the color of the road. His beard needed trimming again, but he hadn't bothered in weeks. And his eyes, washed out gray from years of sun and squinting, moved over storefronts and men and horses without any need to linger, because he didn't come to town to look at people. He came for salt, coffee, lamp oil, nails, and a new whetstone, because the old one had cracked clean through. He told himself that was all, in and out, no delays. The last time he had stayed in town past sundown, some drunk brought up the war and the dead and the part Reed played as a Union scout. And Reed had stopped talking and left because there was nothing to say that could make any of a difference. His wife had been dead 10 years, buried on a hill behind the cabin with a simple cross and a stone. He turned over with his own hands. The ranch was half alive, sometimes less than that, but it was still standing. That was his mission now. Keep it standing, keep the fence rails mended, keep himself fed, keep the days moving in a straight line. He would have gone straight to the general store, if not for the noise coming off the old liver yard. Men gather close, some laughing, some spitting, some standing with that empty attention that comes when there's nothing to do and cruelty passes the time. Reed didn't slow because he wanted to. He slowed because the path narrowed with bodies, and because he heard the word auction, and last one left and worthless, and his hands tightened just a touch on the range before he set the brake. Stepped down, he saw her at once. She was chained to a rough-hewn post, wrists red and bruised from iron. She stood upright, not stiff, not slumped, just upright. Her chin was level. Her eyes were clear and focused on nothing in front of her. Like she had learned, it was safer to look through men than at them. Her dress was torn. Deer skin with fringe that had once been carefully placed. Beads and feathers still hanging in some spots. The neckline ripped down so far, it exposed the top of her chest and the curve of her cleavage. And there was no attempt to cover it, because there was no extra cloth, and because modesty hadn't protected her from anything. Her skin held the color of the country she came from. Sun-warmed copper, and the muscles along her bare arms and calves showed a life of work and walking, and not breaking. She was young, maybe 24. Her hair was black and long and tangled, parts of it braided, parts of it pulled loose by days of wind and handling. Men had been jeering her. He could see that in the set of their mouths and the careless way they leaned in. But she hadn't reacted. She hadn't given them anything. She ain't spoke a word. A man near Reed said, not looking at him, just announcing it to anyone listening. 3 days, others sold quick. Not her, wouldn't kneel, wouldn't cry, just stands there, he spat. Folks say she's cursed or stubborn or both. Reed's jaw worked once. He didn't answer, he stepped closer. His boots sank a fraction into the dry soil. The woman's eyes shifted finally and landed on him. There was no plea there. No hope, no friendliness, no relief. Just a read of him, fast and exact. The way a person checked for threat and decides what to do next. He knew the look, he'd worn it after the war. He still wore it some mornings when he woke and had to remember there was nothing chasing him anymore but memory. He could leave. He knew he could. He could buy his nails and coffee and go home and pretend he hadn't seen her. And he would mend fence rails and oil his lantern and sit by the fire thinking about nothing in particular until Sunday, when he walked up to the grave and told her nothing had changed. But he also knew this. If he left, she would still be there when the sun went down, and some man with less patience and less restraint would have coined his pocket and ideas in his head, and the outcome would be certain. Reed reached inside his coat. His fingers found the folded bills and a few coins he had counted twice that morning. He stepped to the man who seemed to be handling the trade. "How much?" he asked, voice low from disuse. The man blinked, surprised both that Reed spoke and that anyone was interested. He named a number that was less than what Reed had in his hand, but more than the woman was worth to him after 3 days of not selling. Reed didn't haggle. He put the money in the man's palm. The man shrugged, satisfied with something for nothing, and bent to unlock the chains. "You want a bill of sale?" the man asked. "No." The chains fell, the weight left her wrists, but she didn't rub them. She didn't move until Reed turned away. Then she stepped forward because standing there wasn't safer than following, and because every choice left to her was a bad one, but some were worse. Reed didn't touch her. He didn't guide her. He didn't say anything. He walked back to the wagon and climbed up. She climbed in after him and sat on the plank seat, her hands resting in her lap, her shoulders steady. She glanced at the coat he wore, then away. He noticed the cold coming in from the north, and the way her torn dress would handle it. He took off his coat and held it toward her. She stared at it, then at him, and finally she took it, but didn't put on, just held it over her legs. They left Redstone, crossing with the sound of boots and laughter behind them, and nobody followed, and the mule team moved on the road in a rhythm Reed knew by heart, and neither of them said a thing for miles. Reed's mind kept circling back to his land. What needed repairing? How much feed was left? The broken hinge on the chicken coop door. The way winter would close in fast this year if the sky stayed the way it was. He glanced once at her wrists. The skin was raw. He watched her glance toward the horizon and then down at her hands. She kept her face still. He wondered how long she had been moving through the world, keeping her face still. Her name, you would learn later, was Awanada. She had been taken in a raid, dragged through miles of scrub and rock, stripped of language by men who laughed when she didn't answer, and left unsold because pride does not move itself for the sake of anyone's comfort. Her mission now, if the word could even fit, was to stay alive without giving up the last of what made her feel like herself. She would not kneel, she would not beg, she would not say please to men who had none to offer. Survival without bending. That was the line in her head, thin but unbroken. Reed's mission had been simple for years: keep the ranch breathing. Keep himself useful enough to justify another day. Keep his dead wife remembered without letting the grave swallow the rest of his years. Buying her hadn't been in that plan, and he wasn't sure what it meant now that he had. But he knew he hadn't brought her home to own her, and he knew the cabin had room for another bed. And he knew the silence in that place had gotten too heavy to carry much longer. Dusk laid a flat orange light over his land when they arrived. The fence line leaned, the pasture grass was thin, the barn door stuck if he didn't lift it just right. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the well, climbed down. She waited, watching his hands, studying what he did and how he moved. He offered a hand to help her down. She looked at it, didn't take it, stepped down on her own, her bare feet hitting the packed dirt, and a flash of pain crossed her eyes when the ground bit at the raw spots. And then it was gone again. He opened the cabin door and stepped aside, letting her go first, so she could see the space before he moved into it. The cabin was one room with a short wall built half across it to suggest separation. A wood stove that needed a new seal, a table he had built himself with uneven legs, 2 beds, his, and a smaller one he had made when his wife got sick and couldn't climb in and out of the high frame. He gestured toward that bed. Yours, he said, if you wanted. He didn't say anything about the door staying unlocked or locked, or about chores, or about where she could and couldn't go. He didn't draw rules because he didn't know yet what she needed, and he wasn't going to pretend ownership gave him the right to decide it. She stood still, taking everything in. The stove, the bed, the small shelf against the far wall with a folded shirt and a basin on it, the window with a nailed-down shutter, the smell of wood smoke and oil, and the faint trace of woman's soap that lingered on things Reed hadn't thrown away. Her eyes stopped for a second on a ring that lay on the table. Not worn, just kept. Reed followed her gaze, then looked away. He slid the ring into his pocket without comment. "I'll make food," he said. "You can wash. Basin's there. Water's clean." He ladled stew into 2 bowls thick with beans and the last of the summer squash. He set one bowl near her bed and one on the table for himself. He didn't sit across from her. He gave her space to decide where to eat. She chose the floor by the fire, cross-legged, coat across her lap, eyes on the flames. He sat at the table. The room held 2 people in a silence that wasn't hostile, only heavy with new facts. Reed ate slow, listening to the scrape of her spoon against the tin. He thought about the next morning, animals to feed, fences to check, wood to split. He thought about whether she would want to help or prefer to be left alone. He thought about the men in Redstone and how quick they had been to label her useless when what they meant was she wouldn't pretend to be less than she was. When the bowls were empty, he took them, washed them, set them to dry. He laid an extra blanket on the end of her bed and a second one on the chair near, by in case she didn't want to sleep in the bed at all. He pulled a rough plank and a stack of old feed sacks from against the wall, measured the space with his eyes, and started planning where to build a proper divider in the morning so she would have privacy without needing to ask. He didn't say it. He just noted the measurements in his head. Night settled without ceremony. He banked the fire, blew out the lamp. The cabin sank into a low orange glow. She lay on a small bed, eyes open. He lay on a larger one, staring at the roof beams, as he had cut himself, counting the knots the way he always did when sleep didn't come. He heard her breath even out, but not deepen. She wasn't sleeping either. Both of them were listening to the stove, to the night outside, to each other's quiet presence. Reed thought of the grave on the hill, and how he would walk up there on Sunday, and stand with his hat in his hands, and tell his wife the truth. "I brought someone home because leaving her there felt like leaving you, and I couldn't do that again." He felt the old guilt rise and settle. He let it sit. He didn't push it away. He didn't let it rule him either. Owenatata stared at the ceiling and tried to slow her heart, because the sound of a door shutting in darkness still put her back in places she didn't want to remember. And the smell of a strange man's space still made her hands twitch ready to fight. And yet there had been no hand on her arm, no order, no threat. He had given her a bed and a coat and silence. She decided to stay awake long enough to hear if he moved toward her. He didn't. Hours passed. The fire settled the coals. The cold pressed at the walls. Neither of them slept, but neither of them left. In the morning they would work. They didn't know it yet, but the work would become their language. For now, surviving the first night under the same roof without fear or demand was enough. That was the start. That was the mission on both sides. Stay, do no harm, make the space livable. See if trust could exist without being forced into existence. The next morning broke hold. Reed woke to the sound of the wind pushing against the wooden walls and the faint pop of cooling embers in the stove. He turned his head just slightly and saw her, Owenatata curled on her side on the small bed across the room. Reed's old coat tucked around her knees, her eyes were shut, not deeply asleep, but resting. The faintest furrow in her brow told him enough. She'd stayed awake most of the night, same as him. He sat up, joints aching the way they did every morning now. The floor was cold under his bare feet. He moved quietly, not to be courteous, but because noise had long ago stopped being necessary in his life. He dressed, pulled on his boots, stoked the fire, and put water on boil. When he stepped outside, the air bit deep, dry, high country cold. The sky was clear. The pasture stretched toward the hills in a brittle line of yellowed grass and rusted fence posts. He fed the mule through a cracked bucket of oats to the hens and checked the lean-to where a busted hinge still needed mending. Everything was where he left it, quiet, tired, in need of repair. But there was another set of footprints in the dirt now, smaller, barefoot. When he returned to the cabin, Owenato was awake, sitting upright, legs pulled in close, her long hair curtaining part of her face. The coat still covered her, but the torn dress underneath showed more than a hid. Reed glanced once, then looked away, not out of discomfort, but respect. She didn't try to cover herself. She hadn't moved the cot. She hadn't touched anything. Her hands were folded in her lap. "I made coffee," he said, setting a tin cup near her bed. No sugar. She looked at the cup, but didn't reach for it. He didn't press. He sat down at the table with his own and took a sip, wincing slightly at the heat. He needed to say something. He wasn't sure what. She hadn't spoken since the auction. He didn't even know if she spoke English. He doubted it was fluent, if at all. But there were things she needed to know, even without language. "I'll be fixing the fence line today. Got a section down up past the North Trail. After that, the chicken coop needs a new hinge. There's tools outside if you know them." She said nothing. She only blinked once slowly. "You can stay here if you want," he added. "Or come, your choice." He didn't tell her she was free. He didn't know if she'd believe him. Freedom was a word too many men used before doing the opposite of what they promised. He just laid the facts down, plain as he could. She eventually stood slowly, stretching her legs with a quiet stiffness that said she was used to sitting too long in one position. Her bare feet touched the floor with hesitation, and Reed noted the redness on her soles. He crossed to a shelf, pulled out a pair of worn moccasins too small for him, kept from when his wife had once tried to learn leather work, and laid them by the edge of her bed. "They might fit," he said. "If not, I'll fix them." She looked down at them, then up at him. She didn't thank him, but she gave the faintest nod. It was enough. He went out, started working. By the time he was halfway to the north fence line, she was behind him, walking slowly, wrapped in the coat, the moccasins on her feet, her hair braided back now. She didn't ask what to do. She watched him work, watched the way he drove the post deeper, tied the wire, reset the support beams. After maybe an hour, without a word, she picked up a second post and began helping. Her hands were rough, capable. She had done this kind of labor before. They worked without speaking. The wind carried dust around their boots. He handed her a mallet when hers cracked. She didn't smile, didn't look grateful, just accepted it and kept swinging. When they rested, he poured water into a shared canteen and held it out. She drank carefully, then gave it back. That afternoon, they returned to the cabin. Reed chopped wood behind the barn. Owenatada knelt near the chicken coop, inspecting the hinge. She disappeared for a moment and came back with wire and a rusted nail. Fix it herself. He didn't say anything. Just watch her go inside quietly, deliberately. She didn't eat much that night. A few bites of salted pork, a biscuit. She ate slowly, chewing like she had to remind herself to do it. Her eyes didn't stray far from him, never suspicious, but aware. Reed cleared the table and lit the oil lamp. He took out wood and nails and started measuring space near the cot. She sat nearby, arms around her knees, silent as he worked, hammering slowly. she finally spoke. Her voice was soft, cracked from disuse. "Why?" He paused. She said again, firmer. "Why'd you take me?" He set the hammer down and looked at her. His eyes were tired but steady. "Because no one else should have," he said, "and because I had room." She stared at him for a moment, then lowered her gaze. "I don't want to be owned," she said. "You're not wife. No, not slave. No." She nodded once, sharp and final. That was the deal. That was enough for now. Later that night, Reed sat by the fire, slowly cleaning an old bridle. Iwanata moved toward the stove, placed a blanket near it, and lay down on the floor instead of the cot. When he looked at her, she said nothing, just stared at the ceiling. He left her be. She didn't trust the bed. That was fine. Trust would take time. He knew that. He didn't expect her to feel safe here. He only hoped she'd learned she didn't have to run anymore. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance. Inside, the warmth of the fire spread slowly across the floorboards. Reed looked over once before turning in. Her eyes were still open, watching the dark beams above. She wasn't afraid. Not exactly, just alert. And she hadn't run. That was something. Tomorrow would come. So would the next one. If she stayed, he'd build the divider higher, fix the roof over the shed, make another cut. If she left, he wouldn't stop her. But she hadn't left, and he hadn't asked her to. That was where they were. Not family, not strangers, something in between. Not bound by words or paper, but by the fact that neither one of them had walked away. Not yet, and maybe not ever. Morning came with frost edging the windows. The fire had died down to a low heat, but the cabin still held some of yesterday's warmth. Reed stirred early as always, sliding out of bed in practiced silence. When he glanced across the room, he saw her still on the floor beside the stove. She was curled under the blanket, one hand tucked beneath her head, the other resting lightly over her chest. Her breathing was even, her eyes closed. He dressed and stepped outside to start the morning chores. A layer of ice had formed over the water trough, thin, but solid enough to need breaking. He used the heel of his boot, then filled 2 buckets to bring inside. There was a rhythm to the morning, tending to animals, splitting kindling, checking that nothing had gone wrong overnight. And Reed moved through it with the same deliberateness he always had. Only now, he was aware of her presence in a way that tugged slightly at each thought. Not a burden, not a distraction, just a new shape in the old life. We came back inside. She was already up, standing by the window, her arms crossed, still wrapped in the coat he'd given her. She didn't startle when he entered, but her body went a little tenser, like she didn't trust any room not to shift beneath her. He set the buckets down near the basin. "There's hot water on the stove," he said, voice low. "If you want to wash up proper." She didn't answer, just nodded once and stepped away. He turned his back and gave her space. While she cleaned herself slowly, cautiously using the warm water and a scrap of cloth, he busied himself with the stove, frying leftover salt pork and grinding coffee beans. When she finished, she returned the basin to its place and moved back to the far wall. He noticed she had cleaned her face and arms. Her hair was damp, brushed back. Her cheeks were red from scrubbing, but her shoulders were less rigid. They ate at the table this time, not speaking, but not avoiding either, just eating. She watched in between bites, her eyes moving over the lines of his face, the way he held his fork, how methodically he chewed. He noticed, said nothing. Afterward, he pointed toward the barn. "I'll be clearing the south pen. The snow's coming early this year." "I'll come," she said, surprising him. Her voice was firmer than before. Not strong, not warm, just sure. He didn't argue. He simply pulled on his coat and handed her a pair of work gloves. She accepted them without expression. They spent most of the day in a yard behind the barn where broken wood and old fencing had been piled in disuse. Reed hadn't gotten around to sorting it the year before. Now he and Owanada moved the scrap together. She hauled what she could, her hand still raw, but steady. He caught her grimace a few times, but never heard complaint. At midday, they sat on a log and shared a piece of dried meat and bread. The wind had picked up. She pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders. He studied the sky. "You ever work a ranch before?" he asked finally. She was slow to respond. "Then, my father had sheep, not cattle, but I worked." He nodded. "I can tell." She glanced at him, then back at her hands. "Why do you live alone?" Reed shifted. The question didn't sting. It just came from farther away than he'd expected. "My wife died long time ago." Owanatada's face didn't change, but her eyes dropped to the dirt. "You had children?" "No." She nodded like she understood something unspoken. Like that explained everything. After a moment, she said, "They sold me because I wouldn't obey. I wasn't quiet enough." He didn't answer, just watch her face. There was no tear in her voice, no pity in the telling. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was just saying what needed to be said so it wouldn't rot inside her. He said, "You don't have to be quiet here." She looked at him again long and hard. "Even if I speak against you?" she asked. He met her gaze evenly. "You can say what you need." That night, she slept on the cot instead of the floor. He noticed when he rose to bank the fire before bed. She had pulled the blanket, it's tight to her chest. Her arm curled under her cheek. She looked more at peace than she had any night prior. He didn't mention it the next morning. Didn't bring it up at all, but he left a folded shirt by her bed. Soft cotton, something his wife had once sewn for herself, but never wore. Owanada picked it up, held it to her chest, then laid it aside. That day, she helped him mend the chicken pen. She collected the eggs. She swept the cabin when he went to the pasture. Later, as dusk came, she stood at the threshold of the cabin, staring toward the western hills. He came up behind her quietly. "You looking for something?" he asked. She answered without looking back. "Sometimes I think I'll see someone, my sister maybe, or a scout, something from before, but never comes." He nodded. "I looked too. Every Sunday," she turned then, brows drawn slightly for her. He didn't answer out loud, just nodded. They stood there in the doorway together as the sun dipped low, side by side, not touching, not speaking more. But something had shifted. They were no longer two strangers under the same roof. They were two people beginning to share a life. Uneven, quiet, but real. In town, they'd called her unsellable. Here, she was learning to be seen. And he, Reed Halston, the man who hadn't spoken more than 5 words a day for 10 years, was learning that staying didn't have to mean staying buried in the past. The following days unfolded without incident, but something had changed between them, subtle as it was. The silence was still there, but it had softened. Owanada no longer kept her back to him when she moved through the cabin. She no longer flinched when he came in from the yard. Reed noticed how she began tidying without being asked, stacking firewood, sweeping out the corners, brushing down the mule's coat after he came in from the field. She didn't act like a guest or a servant. She simply moved like someone who had decided for now to stay. The shirt he'd left by her bed was being worn now, loosely over the torn dress. The sleeves were too long, and the fabric hung low over her curves, but she didn't seem to mind. It covered her more than before, though her deerskin dress still peeked from underneath. Worn, frayed, especially at the neckline. The rip across her chest hadn't been repaired. When she bent forward, the fabric parted slightly, exposing the warm curve of her cleavage. Reed caught himself looking once, just once, then forced his gaze to the floor. She didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did, and simply didn't care anymore. The tension between them wasn't desire. It was something slower, weightier. It came from sharing space without force, from surviving together in silence. On Thursday, she followed him out to the far field where the fencing needed mending. The sun was harsh that day, and she worked with sleeves rolled up, sweat trailing down the line of her throat. He offered her water. She drank without hesitation. Then they kept working. Midway through the afternoon, she asked something that caught him off guard. What happened to her? Her voice was quiet but clear. Your wife Reed didn't answer right away. He kept tying wire to the post, then leaned back against the fence and wiped his brow. Fever, he said finally. Got sick one spring. Didn't get better. She lasted 6 days. Buried her behind the cabin. Owenata looked toward the tree-line. No children, no family, none that stayed. She nodded slowly like that made sense. Same, they stood in the field, wind rustling the grass around them. The sun shifting lower in the sky. Reed asked, your tribe, they think you're dead. She didn't answer for a long time. Then maybe or they wish I were. I was supposed to marry someone. I refused. They said I dishonor my father. After the raid, no one came looking. That was all she said. It was enough. When they returned to the cabin that evening, Owenata washed at the basin while Reed lit the lamp and stirred the stew. He watched her in the glass reflection, her long hair loose now, her collarbone visible through the open shirt, the scars and marks that told quiet stories he didn't ask to hear. Her body was strong, but no longer guarded. There was still war in her, but it wasn't against him anymore. After dinner, she sat by the fire, cross-legged, her eyes half-lidded in thought. He sat in the chair behind her, his hands working slowly on a broken strap of leather. The fire crackled. A long time passed before she spoke again. I don't know what I am here. Reed looked up. She continued, voice low, not a wife, not a slave, not part of a tribe. I wake up, I work, I eat, but I don't know what I'm becoming. He set the leather down and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You're someone who's still standing, he said. That's more than most. She turned toward him, her expression unreadable. And you, where are you now? He thought about it, tired, he said, but trying. The corner of her mouth twitched. Almost a smile. Almost. Later, as the fire burned down and the shadows stretched longer across the floor, she moved closer to him. Not quickly, not directly, but with purpose. She sat beside his chair on the floor, near enough that their knees nearly touched. Reed didn't move. His heart was beating slow but heavy. She placed her hand over his rough palm against calloused knuckles. He looked down at their joined hands, then at her. She didn't speak. He didn't pull away. That night, she slept in the cot again. But before she lay down, she reached out and touched his arm as he passed by. Just a small touch, a thank you, or something else entirely. Reed lay awake longer than usual, listening to the quiet of the cabin, the steady breathing across the room. He didn't know what they were becoming. He only knew that the silence between them no longer felt hollow. It felt like the start of something that didn't need a name yet, and for the first time in a decade, he didn't visit the grave the next morning. He stayed inside, and so did she. The snow came earlier than expected. It began as a thin flurry just before dawn. Fine white dust brushing against the window glass. By midday, it thickened into a slow, steady fall that blanketed the ridge lines and softened the edges of the pasture. Reed stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching it coat the fence posts. It was quiet, still, the kind of quiet that pressed into your chest. Inside the cabin, Owenata stirred the fire, her shirt sleeves rolled up, hair braided tight down her back. She moved differently now, still alert, still guarded, but not like she was waiting for something to break. She moved like she lived there. Reed came in, stomping the snow off his boots. She handed him a warm cup of broth without a word. He nodded, grateful. Their routines had settled into something close to rhythm. He still rose early and took care of the livestock. She cleaned, mended, prepared meals when she felt like it, and joined in the fields when the weather allowed. But something unspoken had begun to shift. Neither of them had said it out loud, but the touches were more frequent now. A hand brushed against a shoulder when passing. A quiet moment at the table when their eyes stayed locked a little too long. It wasn't romantic in the way stories tell it. It was quieter, slower, earned. That evening, as the storm thickened and the wind beat harder against the cabin walls, Awanade pulled her bedding closer to the fire. She wore the same patched deerskin dress beneath Reed's shirt. The shirt gaped slightly at the chest now that the buttons were worn. The heat from the fire had made her skin flush faintly, and the curve of her neckline was visible in the lamplight. Reed noticed, but not with hunger. It was something closer to sorrow, like looking at something that deserved better than it had ever been given. "I never asked where you learned to mend fences," he said suddenly. Anada glanced up. "My grandfather taught me. He said, if you could fix a fence, you could keep anything alive. Livestock people." Reed nodded, then sipped from his cup. After a moment she asked, "Why don't you ever go to town? Not even for church?" He shrugged slightly. "There's nothing there for me. Town doesn't change. I did." She tilted her head. "People talk about you. I know. They say you went mad after the war." He set the cup down. "I came back with less than I left with. That's not madness. That's math." Awanada didn't smile, but she understood. She moved closer to the fire. The lamp flickered low. She sat near his feet now, her legs tucked beneath her, one hand on the floor, steadying herself. "I used to think silence was punishment," she said quietly. "After I was taken, they didn't speak to me unless command. I stopped speaking too. It was easier." Reed looked at her, his voice low. "Here, silence isn't punishment, it's peace." She looked at him for a long time, then nodded slowly. That night, she stood before the stove, waiting for the coals to settle. Reed sat behind her, rubbing his palms together from the chill. She turned to him, took a step closer than another. He didn't move, just watched her. She reached out, placed a hand on his chest, flat and warm, right over the place where his heartbeat lived. Her eyes didn't ask anything. They just looked. Reed's voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you sure?" She nodded. I stayed, and with that, she leaned in, pressing her lips softly to his. It wasn't long. It wasn't heated, just real present, a choice. Reed didn't pull her in further. He didn't lead, he let her decide everything. She pulled back after a moment and stepped away back to the cot. She didn't say goodnight. He sat there long after the fire settled, his chest tight, not from desire but from something heavier. The sense that for the first time in years, he might not be alone anymore, and that she might finally feel the same. By morning, the snow covered everything in sight, but inside the cabin, something had warmed, and neither of them would name it. Not yet, but both had stopped looking at the door. By the second week of snow, the road into Redstone was iced over and impassable. The ranch became its own world, white, still, and sealed off. Reed kept the fire burning through the day, hauling and chopped wood twice daily. Owenatata swept, boiled broth, patched torn blankets, and mended leather straps by the window while the storm outside howled like a voice, trying to call them back to a life neither of them missed. Inside, they moved around each other without the old stiffness. They didn't speak much, but when they did, the words came easier. Reed didn't ask her about the men who had taken her. Anada didn't ask what Reed had done during the war. They shared everything but the pain that had come before because that didn't need explaining. She slept in the cot still, but each night she placed it closer to the fire and closer to his own bed. She didn't say why. He didn't ask, but when the fire crackled low at night and her hand dangled over the edge, she no longer